Friends, Americans, global citizens trapped in an airport lounge with CNN on repeat, lend me your ears. Today, we're diving headfirst into the whirlwind of Trump's trade policy, a world where tariffs are the weapon of choice, and the beat of the tango is set by the clanging of closing cash registers. Buckle up, because things are about to get tariffing. Donald Trump, a man who built his empire on branding and bravado, brought that same energy to the Oval Office, particularly when it came to trade. Forget diplomacy and nuance. Trump preferred the blunt force of tariffs, those pesky little taxes on imported goods. He saw them as the ultimate bargaining chip, a way to bring those pesky foreigners to heel and make America great again, one import tax at a time. But as with most things Trump, the reality of his tariff tango was far more complicated than the campaign trail rhetoric. Supporters cheered, claiming he was finally standing up for American workers and businesses. Critics cried foul, warning of economic disaster and a global trade war. So who was right? Grab a stiff drink, or maybe two, and let's unpack this trade war trunk. China, the Middle Kingdom, the land of delicious dumplings and, according to Trump, the ultimate economic frenemy. From day one, Trump railed against China, accusing them of unfair trade practices, intellectual property theft, and basically being sneaky, job-stealing ninjas. His solution? Tariffs, of course. In 2018, Trump slapped tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. China, not one to back down from a good old-fashioned trade spat, retaliated with tariffs of their own. And just like that, we were in the midst of a full-blown trade war, with no clear winner and plenty of casualties on both sides. American businesses, particularly farmers who relied on exporting their soybeans and pork to China, felt the burn. Chinese consumers faced higher prices for everything from iPhones to soybeans. The global economy shuddered, and the only ones laughing all the way to the bank were probably the manufacturers of those little stress balls shaped like globes. Now, you might think that starting a trade war with China, America's biggest economic rival, would be enough for one presidency, but this is Trump we're talking about. He wasn't content with just targeting China. He also decided to take aim at some of America's closest allies. In 2018, Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Canada, Mexico, and the European Union. His rationale? National security, of course, because nothing says threat to national security like a Canadian maple syrup pipeline or a Belgian waffle iron factory operating on US soil. Unsurprisingly, these tariffs didn't exactly go over well with America's allies. Canada and Mexico, already fuming over Trump's attempts to renegotiate NAFTA, retaliated with tariffs of their own. The European Union, never one to miss out on a good tariff tiff, followed suit. The result? Strained relationships, increased costs for businesses, and a whole lot of head-scratching from anyone who thought America was supposed to be strengthening alliances, not starting trade wars with their friends. If there's one thing Trump loves more than a good tariff, it's the art of the deal. And in his mind, tariffs were the ultimate bargaining chip, the economic equivalent of holding your breath until you turn blue to get what you want. He threatened tariffs on everything from European cars to Mexican avocados, using them as leverage in trade negotiations. Sometimes it worked, like when he renegotiated NAFTA into the USMCA, a deal that was basically NAFTA 2.0 with a new name and a few tweaks around the edges. Other times it backfired spectacularly, like when his trade war with China dragged on for years, costing both countries billions of dollars and achieving very little. The problem with using tariffs as a negotiating tactic is that they're a blunt instrument. They inflict pain on both sides, create uncertainty in the global economy, and often result in unintended consequences. It's like trying to perform brain surgery with a sledgehammer. Messy, imprecise, and likely to leave everyone involved feeling worse off. After a brief hiatus from the White House, Trump is back, and he's brought his trusty tariffs with him. In a move that surprised absolutely no one, Trump announced a new round of tariffs in April 2025, targeting pretty much everyone and everything. We're talking reciprocal tariffs on most of the $3.3 trillion in American imports, potentially hitting everything from refrigerators and appliances to toys and textiles. He's even floated the idea of a 10% tariff on all imports just for good measure. And let's not forget his old nemesis, China, who he's now threatening with tariffs of 60% or more. This new wave of tariffs has sent shockwaves through the global economy, with markets tumbling and businesses scrambling to adjust. Supporters cheer, claiming it's about time someone stood up to those pesky foreigners and protected American jobs. Critics warn of economic disaster, higher prices for consumers, and a further erosion of America's standing in the world. It's a familiar tune, but this time the stakes are even higher. Now, let's be fair and balanced, like that cable news channel nobody actually watches. Trump's tariff tango may have been about as graceful as a rhinoceros on roller skates, but he did have his supporters. And they had their reasons, even if those reasons sometimes sounded like they were whispered to them by a dude in a tinfoil hat. For the pro-tariff crowd, it's all about sticking it to those job-stealing foreigners and bringing back the good old days of American manufacturing. They argue that decades of free trade agreements have hollowed out the American industrial base, sending jobs overseas and leaving hard-working Americans high and dry. Tariffs, they say, are the only way to level the playing field, protect American jobs, and make America great again. They point to companies like Ashley Furniture, whose founder, Ron Wanek, is a vocal supporter of Trump's tariffs. Wanek argues that tariffs on Chinese furniture imports have helped protect American jobs and allowed his company to thrive. And who are we to argue with a guy who knows a thing or two about comfy recliners? On the other side of the trade war trenches, you have the critics, a motley crew of economists, business leaders, and anyone who's ever enjoyed a reasonably priced avocado. They argue that Trump's tariffs are nothing more than a giant tax hike on American consumers and businesses, a self-inflicted wound that's hurting the very people they're supposed to help. They point to studies showing that tariffs have increased prices for businesses and consumers, stifled economic growth, and disrupted global supply chains. The Tax Foundation, for example, estimates that Trump's 2018 to 2019 tariffs reduced long-run GDP by 0.2%, capital stock by 0.1%, and employment by 142,000 full-time equivalent jobs. And let's not forget about those poor, forgotten souls, the American families facing up to $830 a year in higher costs thanks to those pesky tariffs. Even some of Trump's fellow Republicans have expressed concerns about his tariff-happy ways. Senator Rand Paul has been a vocal critic, arguing that tariffs are nothing more than taxes that punish American consumers. And former Biden administration official Alex Jaquez criticized Trump's focus on tariffs over the cost of living and economic stability, pointing out the obvious, namely that making things more expensive doesn't magically make them better. Like a messy divorce, Trump's trade wars have left a trail of winners and losers in their wake. Some industries, like steel and aluminum, have benefited from tariffs, at least in the short term. But these gains have been offset by losses in other sectors, particularly agriculture, manufacturing, and retail. American farmers who rely heavily on exports have been hit particularly hard by retaliatory tariffs from China and other countries. The manufacturing sector, already struggling with automation and outsourcing, has faced higher costs for raw materials and uncertainty in global supply chains. And retailers, caught between rising costs and price-sensitive consumers, have been forced to raise prices, cut jobs, or both. The reality is that tariffs are a blunt instrument that rarely achieve their intended goals. They create winners and losers, distort markets, and often lead to unintended consequences. And in the case of Trump's trade wars, the biggest loser of all may be the very thing he claimed to be protecting, the American economy. As the curtain falls on Trump's tumultuous presidency, his legacy on trade remains a subject of intense debate. Supporters argue that he finally stood up to China and other countries that have been taking advantage of the United States for too long. They point to the USMCA as evidence of his deal-making prowess and argue that his tariffs, while painful in the short term, were necessary to protect American jobs and industries. Critics, on the other hand, argue that Trump's trade wars were a reckless and ultimately self-defeating exercise that damaged America's economy, alienated its allies, and undermined its standing in the world. They point to the economic damage caused by his tariffs, the strained relationships with key allies, and the lack of any significant concessions from China as evidence of his failed approach. Only time will tell what the long-term consequences of Trump's tariff tango will be. But one thing is for sure, his presidency has left a lasting mark on the global trading system, one that will continue to be felt for years to come.